At 2:17 a.m., the first section of the bridge slipped into the river and vanished under the current. The men froze. The night was black and soundless except for the water and the distant growl of tank engines waiting in the fields behind them. Someone whispered, "If we lose another panel, the whole army stays stuck." No one answered. There was nothing to say. France, August 6, 1944. The war in Normandy had turned from chaos into pursuit. The Americans had broken through at Saint-Lô, and now they needed to move fast. But the Germans had destroyed every bridge across the Vire River. The 2nd Armored Division was halted, 30 tons of steel and fuel idling behind mud and darkness. The only way forward was to build a new bridge before dawn. The task fell to the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, commanded by Major David Pergrin, 27 years old and already older than the war had made him. His men had been awake for 48 hours. They were mechanics, farmers, miners, kids from Pennsylvania and Ohio who could build anything. If only the shells would stop long enough to let them breathe. At 9 p.m., the order came through. Bailey Bridge, 300 feet. Completion required by first light. No machinery, no floodlights, just hands, ropes, wrenches, and faith. The river ran black and cold under the ruined French moon. John Peterson, a private with a pencil tucked behind his ear, wrote in his notebook by the light of a cigarette. The river looked endless. We could hear the tanks waiting behind us, engines idling like beasts that couldn't be tamed. They began by hauling the first pontoon sections into place, hollow steel floats, each weighing over 1,000 pounds. The current fought them like a living thing. Men stripped off jackets and boots, stepped into the water, and disappeared to their waists. The bridge creaked, groaned, shifted. Metal screamed against metal. At 11:30, one of the pontoons slipped its mooring. It spun in the current, slamming into a piling, and was gone. For a heartbeat, the line broke. The whole operation could have failed right there. But without orders, 3 men dove after it, dragged it back with ropes biting into their palms, teeth clenched, half drowned but laughing when they pulled it ashore. They didn't laugh for long. Artillery began to murmur in the distance, dull, heavy, getting closer. Pergrin moved between crews, his uniform soaked, voice even but sharp. Keep working. Don't look up. Don't think about the noise. His job wasn't to inspire. It was to keep them moving. In the dark, the hammering of pins and the rattle of wrenches sounded like a factory somewhere deep underground. Each panel of the Bailey Bridge weighed 600 pounds, lattice steel sections that had to be carried, lifted, and locked into place by hand. The men worked in teams of 4, breathing through their teeth, arms trembling. They spoke little, except for curses, grunts, and the occasional hold it steady. A truck backfired on the far bank, and every head snapped up. The sound was too close to a mortar. For a moment, all movement stopped. The night pressed in like a fist. Then someone muttered, "Let's go." And the hammer started again. By midnight, they'd completed the first 40 feet. The bridge glimmered faintly, a fragile skeleton stretching over black water. Behind them, a sergeant stood knee-deep in mud, counting panels under his breath. The men looked older than they were, outlines lit by occasional flashes of lightning somewhere beyond the front line. Peterson wrote another line. "We build because if we don't, no one gets home." Around 1 a.m., the current shifted. One section groaned dangerously. Pergrin and a corporal crawled along the narrow steel decking, tightening the bolts with numb hands. Every few minutes, someone called out a number, distance completed, progress made, a small piece of sanity in the middle of madness. Then, at 2:17, the bridge gave its warning groan. One of the panels slipped, slow at first, then faster, sliding away until it vanished under the black current. The sound of it, the splash, the hollow clang, was louder than the artillery. The men froze. You could almost hear them breathe. Pergrin didn't shout. He just said, "Get another." They dragged a replacement from the shore. The mud clung to their boots, the river pulled at their knees, and the metal burned their palms. The wind carried the smell of oil and algae and fear. At 2:40, they locked the new panel in place. No one cheered. They just kept going. By 3 a.m., they'd built 40 feet. The far bank was still invisible, the current still clawing at the pontoons. And then, from somewhere across the water, came a new sound, a distant cough of a machine gun, short and sharp. Peterson looked up. The others did too. The Germans had finally noticed. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The first shell hit the far bank. Then came the machine guns, cutting the night like a saw. Tracer lines stitched low over the water, red threads pulled too tight. Men flinched, then forced themselves not to. Somewhere beyond the trees, a German gunner corrected his aim by inches. The river took the sound and stretched it thin. At 3:15 the battalion log would record, in a hand too neat for darkness. Enemy fire commenced 0315 hours. No work stoppage reported. On the bridge, that sentence translated to teeth grinding, hands moving, bolts turning. Work or die, the math was simple. They were building a Bailey bridge, panel by panel. Lattice steel rectangles, 600 pounds apiece, shouldered and shoved into position without cranes or floodlights. From men to a panel, two to pin it, one to call the rhythm. The current clawed at the pontoons, each float a stubborn lung holding the bridge up against the pull of the wire. Boots slipped on wet decking, knuckles split and went slick. Down, someone hissed as a burst walked toward them. The men flattened, ribs against cold steel, faces turned to the river's stink, algae, oil, mud. The tracers passed overhead, hissed out, and the night swallowed the evidence. They rose together without a word and kept going. Corporal Alan Brooks took a sliver of hot metal in the shoulder. He felt it more as a punch than a cut. A medic reached for him, but Brooks shook him off and grabbed the bag of locking pins with his other hand. "I can still carry the pins," he said through his teeth. "My legs work, that's enough." He moved down the line, offering metal like a priest offering wafer, each pin a small promise that the next section would hold. A pontoon shifted under a new crosscurrent, bumping hard against its neighbor. The lashings sang. A private shouted, "She's drifting." Pergrin was already moving toward the problem, crawling the narrow spine of decking with a wrench between his teeth. The pontoon tugged once, twice. Then the knot gave and the float began to swing out into black water. "Let it go." Pergrin barked over the noise. "We'll rebuild. We don't stop." The private hesitated. Every piece of steel mattered, but he obeyed, because hesitation is how bridges die. The float spun away, caught light, and was gone into the dark downstream. A new one slid forward on rough hands before its wake had flattened. The enemy guns fell into a pattern. 3 short bursts. Pause, search, correct. The engineers learned to breathe inside the pauses. Pin, hammer, slide, drop. Wait. Then the saw cuts again, the tiny sparks when rounds found steel. A man cursed without volume when a bullet shaved his sleeve. The river kept talking under all of it, low and indifferent. A shell landed close enough to lift men from the deck and set them back down an inch to the left. Ears rang. The world narrowed to a thud in the skull and a high whine that made speech ridiculous. For a long handful of seconds, no one moved. Somewhere, a tool fell and found metal with a bright, childlike ping. That was enough. A hand reached, then another, and the work resumed, slower at first, then steady. Courage looked like that, not a shout, but a rhythm rediscovered. Peterson wrote later, the pencil scratching in a foxed notebook now held in some county archive. "It was like building a church under a storm. We didn't pray. We set pins." He underlined set pins twice. By 4:20 they were knee-deep into the river's middle voice. The far bank still hid behind smoke and hedgerow. A flare popped somewhere upstream, through a green light that made every face a mask. A German MG-42 replied with its cruel sewing machine speed. Heads. Came the warning, and men ducked, hands still working by memory. Brooks knelt to brace a panel, blood crawling down his sleeve in a dark line he refused to acknowledge. "Number?" Pergrin called. 85 feet, came the answer, then 90, then 105, numbers stepping across water one boot length at a time. The count steadied them more than sandbags would have. The bridge grew not as a structure, but as a sentence completed under fire. At 5 o'clock, a team on the left bank reported a gap opening where the current had bullied 2 floats out of alignment. "Rope! Rope now!" the squad leader yelled, voice cracking. 2 men slid from the deck into that black cold without waiting for orders. Hands found rope. Rope found steel. A knot formed underwater where fingers had to choose between dexterity and warmth. Hold it, hold. The float nosed back, sulking, then settled. Pinned. One of the swimmers gasped, hauling himself onto the decking. His lips were the wrong color. Someone clapped him once between the shoulders, a small, rough benediction. Dawn seeped into the east like a bruise, turning yellow. The sky lifted an inch, then two. With light came a new accuracy from the far bank. Rounds walked closer. A section leader lay flat, cheek pressed to the decking, and studied bullet strikes like a carpenter reads grain. "They're short on the right," he murmured. "We've got a blind." He waved his men through the exposed gap, where a second before no one would have risked it. They went because he sounded like a man measuring wood, not fear. By 6 o'clock they reached the river's crown. The deepest pull, the place where the Vire pushed hardest simply because it could. The bridge flexed, complained, then behaved. Peregrine looked from bank to bank and for the first time allowed himself the thought that the thing in front of them might become a road. The radio cracked and hissed. A voice from the rear, formal even through static, command to 3-1. Tanks need crossing by 8. Peregrine swallowed the reply that wanted to come out. He keyed the handset. 3-1. Bridge incomplete. Estimate 2 hours. A pause. Another voice now, cooler, ironed. You have one. For a moment, everything he'd kept pushed low in his chest tried to rise. The dead weight of fatigue, the ache in hands that had stopped belonging to him 3 hours ago, the bitter knowledge of what an hour meant in steel and sweat. He pushed it all back down like you push a stubborn panel into a tight slot. He clipped the handset to his belt and looked at his men, mud-faced, river-cold, eyes wide and simple with the job. You heard it, he said. 1 hour. Nobody cursed. Nobody cheered. They just moved faster. Behind them, engines rumbled, Shermans impatient as cattle at a gate. In front of them, the river set its shoulder and leaned. At 7:47, the first tank driver rolled his machine forward, inching onto a bridge that was not yet finished. The deck shuddered, and the engineers kept building under the weight. The sun was coming up, and so were the German bombers. By 6:30 a.m., the first light slid across the Vire like a blade, cutting the mist into ribbons. Men blinked against it, their faces raw from sleeplessness and smoke. They'd been working for 9 straight hours. The bridge stretched 230 feet now, a skeleton of steel and will, half floating, half sinking. The last 50 feet still stood between them and the far bank. Then the engines came. Low, heavy, the kind that crawled into your bones before you even looked up. Air raid, someone shouted. But there was nowhere to run. No trenches, no cover, just river and mud. Peregrine didn't yell. He just said, down. They flattened on the bridge, cold steel under them, breath pressed to their sleeves. The first bombs fell wide, flashes in the trees, geysers of mud and water. Then closer. A concussion lifted a pontoon clear off the river, dropped it back with a crack like thunder. Metal groaned, bolts screamed, and still the men didn't move. When the planes passed, the silence was worse. Then, one by one, the engineers rose, brushed off the mud, and went back to work. Peterson wrote later, "We didn't even look up anymore. If the sky wanted to kill us, it had its chance." The river had turned a sick green under the daylight. Smoke hung low, tasting of oil and iron. Someone coughed, spat black, then laughed, a dry, joyless sound. At 7 o'clock, a gust of wind caught one of the center pontoons. It began to twist with the current, pulling the rest of the bridge with it. Rope! A sergeant yelled. Get me rope now. 2 men ran, one carrying coil, the other a hammer. The line went taut, humming under strain. A second later, the knot slipped. Without hesitation, the 2 of them dove into the river. The current spun them sideways, slammed them into the pontoon wall. They disappeared for a heartbeat. Then one hand surfaced, gripping the rope. The other man surfaced too, coughing, face pale, but alive. Together they tied off the section. The bridge held. Peregrine crouched at the edge, yelling through the spray, "Get back here." The swimmer just shouted back, "It's pinned," before collapsing into the mud. No medals were given that day. There was no time. At 7:15, radio static crackled. The message came through clipped, urgent, General Polk. Tank column delayed. Must cross at 0800 hours. Peregrine snatched the handset. We're not ready. The decking's short 40 feet. The reply was ice cold. You have 45 minutes. He looked at his men, faces streaked with grease, eyes rimmed red. All right, he said. We finish it. The last panels came forward, heavy, rusted, wet. Each step shook the whole structure. The air smelled of cordite and sweat. Brooks, his arm bandaged from shrapnel, hauled bolts with one hand and pinned with the other. A bomber returned, diving low, guns spitting across the field. The men didn't flinch. They worked through it, heads down, feet slipping. Peterson wrote, "We stopped hearing the war. Only the sound of tools. It was louder than fear." By 7:35, the bridge was 2/3 secure. Enough for light armor, maybe not for tanks. But the first Sherman was already lining up. The driver leaned out of his hatch, face black with exhaust. "We going or not?" Pergrin shouted back, "Wait 5 minutes." But the engine roared louder, the sound of orders given somewhere far above any of them. At 7:47 a.m., the first tank rolled forward. The bridge dipped under its weight, a low groan of steel under strain. Men stepped aside, hands gripping the rails. The water slapped against the pontoons, angry and fast. For a moment, it seemed the whole thing might collapse. Bolts creaked, ropes snapped, and a shower of river spray hit Pergrin square in the face. He didn't move. He just watched the treads grind forward, inch by inch. When the tank reached the halfway point, the bridge steadied. The steel flexed, then locked. The tank made it across. The second followed. On the near bank, one soldier whispered, "It's holding." Another answered, "For now." Pergrin turned to Peterson. "How much left?" 40 feet, he said. "Then we're not done." He picked up a wrench, stepped back onto the trembling span, and started bolting again, as if the war could wait another hour for a bridge to become whole. Behind him, the tanks kept coming. And ahead, the far bank was still burning. The first tank moved forward. The bridge bent, then screamed. The engineers froze. One more inch, and it would have folded like paper. Dawn spread across the wire like pale smoke. Mist clung to the river, mixing with exhaust and cordite. Men on both banks stood silent, watching the span shiver under the tank's weight. Steel panels moaned, wooden planks popped, bolts sang low. Sergeant William Carney didn't watch from shore. He ran beside the first Sherman, boots slamming the decking, one hand brushing the rail for balance. "Hold," he whispered, as if the bridge could hear him. When the tank hit the midpoint, the structure dipped dangerously. Carney's eyes caught it. A pontoon slipping sideways, rope slack. Without thinking, he leapt toward it. His boots slid, fingers found the cleat, and he tied the line by instinct alone. The bridge steadied. German mortars began to fall. The first shell landed long. The second tore up the far bank, showering them with mud. Shrapnel clattered across the deck. The men flattened against the cold steel, then rose and kept working, tightening bolts, replacing pins, checking each joint like surgeons under fire. Carney stayed crouched, counting seconds between explosions. The air stank of fuel and river rot. A bullet struck the panel beside his head. He didn't flinch. He hammered the next pin home and slapped the rail twice. The all-clear signal. The tank driver nodded, nudged forward. The bridge groaned, then held. On the near bank, Major David Pergrin watched through a haze of dust. He'd built bridges his whole career. None like this. Behind him, more tanks idled, engines growling for their turn. When a runner shouted, "Second platoon ready," Pergrin just said, 30 seconds after he's across. The first tank reached the far side at 7:58 a.m. A clerk crouched in a trench, writing with a stub of pencil. Bridge load test successful under combat fire. First armored vehicle crossed 0758 HRS. Then the next tank came, and another. The engineers moved around them, tightening what the weight loosened, hammering fresh bolts into place. Smoke thickened, men coughed, but didn't stop. Every sound mattered. The squeal of metal, the whine of cable, the short, sharp hiss when water hit hot steel. A shell burst close, throwing up a wall of spray. For a moment, the bridge vanished. When the mist cleared, it was still there, and so was Carney, soaked, grinning, rope in hand. "Keep them moving," he shouted. "She'll hold." By 8 o'clock, a rhythm had formed. Tank, pause, tank, hammer, shout. The river frothed under the pontoons, but couldn't tear them free. The engineers worked as if possessed, faces blank, hands sure. every motion a refusal to let the bridge die. Mortars shifted their aim to the shore, but the men on the span didn't even look up. Courage here wasn't loud. It was methodical, a rhythm of pins and bolts against chaos. At 8:14, the 30th tank rolled across. When its treads hit dry ground, the deck sagged once, then settled. The sound that followed wasn't a cheer, just an exhausted exhale. The last man off the bridge, a private from the pin crew, stopped and turned. Smoke drifted low, hiding the far bank. The river glared up at the span, angry, waiting. But the bridge still stood, bent, trembling, black with soot, alive. He looked once more, just to be sure it was real. It was. By 8:15, the order came. All clear. Armor advancing west. Engines roared, and the line of tanks rolled into the rising sun. Carney sat down hard on the decking, breathing in the sharp smell of oil and victory. The steel beneath him creaked, tired but proud. The bridge that shouldn't have held did. They expected to die on that river. Instead, they watched the tanks roll into the sunrise and realized they'd changed the course of the war. By 9 a.m., the bridge was quiet again. Smoke drifted over the water like a curtain refusing to fall. The engineers stood ankle-deep in mud, faces hollow with exhaustion. No one spoke for a long time. The tanks were gone, clattering west toward Avranches, leaving only tracks, scorch marks, and the low hum of the river beneath them. Major David Pergrin wiped his hands on his uniform, leaving streaks of oil and blood. He stared at the bridge that shouldn't have survived and muttered, 14 hours. It sounded like both a confession and a prayer. A sergeant beside him laughed once, dry and low. Sir, we built a miracle. Pergrin shook his head. No, Sergeant. We built a road. That afternoon, the engineers began to dismantle the temporary ramp on the far bank. German artillery still boomed somewhere beyond the hills, but distant now, like thunder from another world. For the first time in days, they could smell grass instead of cordite. A jeep arrived with dispatch riders and a photographer. The correspondent stepped out, camera dangling, and asked, "Who's in charge here?" Pergrin pointed toward the bridge. "She is." The man laughed, thinking it a joke. But when he looked closer, saw the cracked decking, the burned ropes, the bolts bent from stress. He stopped smiling. The photographer raised his camera, took 2 shots, then lowered it again. "Hell," he said softly. "I should have been here yesterday." That night, in a field near St. Lo, the engineers set up camp. They ate from cold tins, too tired to talk. Around the fires, someone began humming an old hymn, wordless, slow. Others joined in. It wasn't celebration. It was survival made audible. Pergrin sat with his journal open on his knees. He wrote, "Bridge held. Casualties, minor." Then, after a long pause, he added another line. "I don't know how it held. I still hear it creak when I close my eyes." He closed the notebook and listened to the crickets. The war, for most, had already moved on. But for these men, it stayed here, fixed between 2 banks of a nameless French river. The next morning, the official orders came down. Proceed south. Prepare new crossings. They broke camp, loaded their trucks, and drove past the bridge one last time. It still stood, blackened, scarred but whole. The river hissed beneath it, impatient to reclaim what was stolen. A private in the back of a truck leaned out and saluted. "See you in another life, sweetheart," he said under his breath. The others didn't laugh. They just watched until the span disappeared behind the trees. By that evening, reports were already arriving at headquarters. Second Armored through Avranches. German line collapsing. Corridor open. History would call it the breakout, the moment Patton's army burst into the open fields of France. But for the 291st Engineer Battalion, it would always be the morning a pile of steel and sweat decided to defy gravity and logic at once. A week later, a war correspondent filed a short piece for the Stars and Stripes. American engineers built a 280-foot bridge under fire in 14 hours, saving 48 hours of advance time. No names were printed, just a number, a place, and a result. In another folder, one that never reached the paper, the same reporter had written a line he cut before submission. No one remembers who fires the guns, but they should remember who built the road to them. By the time the issue came out, the war had already shifted to new fronts. The men who built that bridge were digging new ones. The old span was left behind, anonymous and uncelebrated it. But sometimes, when they closed their eyes, they could still hear it. The groan of metal, the slap of water, the creak of something refusing to break. And somewhere in that sound, the war was still crossing. In 1979, an old man from Pennsylvania wrote a letter to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. "Does anyone remember the bridge we built near St. Lo?" he asked. August 44. Via River. 14 hours under fire. Weeks passed, then months. The reply came back polite and empty. No photographic record located. Consult National Archives. He did. There was nothing. No caption, no print, no map pin. The file for the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion listed road repairs, mine clearing, a crossing near Huey later in the year. But the wire? Blank paper. He tried another folder, then another. He recognized names he'd lived beside in mud. Pergrin, Brooks, Carney. Still, the bridge itself seemed to have slipped the record the way the first pontoon once slipped the current, swallowed by time without a splash. An archivist took pity. She was young enough to be his granddaughter and careful enough to wear cotton gloves in a room that smelled like old paper and damp wool. Sometimes the field reports missed the index, she said. She went into the stacks and came back with a gray envelope that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside lay a single carbon sheet, corners curled, typed lines wobbling where the ribbon had gone thin. At the bottom, a small, stubborn signature in fountain pen. D. Pergrin, Major, 291 Arbin. The line above it read, "Bridge constructed under fire in approximate 14 hours. Total span 280 feet. First armor crossed 0758 HRS. Casualties minor." The old man held the page like something breathing. "There," he whispered. "There you are." A year later, the battalion veterans met in a VFW hall with a low ceiling and a bar that knew their names. They wore jackets with patches that had outlived the uniforms, and they carried small boxes the way men carry photographs. Out came the proofs that memory had kept better than the state. A bent wrench, a pocket journal stained the color of river water, a fragment of rope with one hard knot left in it, and a bolt, cracked through the shoulder like a tooth. Carney, slower now, but still a man you listened to, set the bolt in the center of the table. "Took this out of the decking after the 30th tank," he said. She held anyway. He looked around the room. "We didn't fight the Germans that day." He tapped the bolt. "We fought gravity." A local reporter stopped by, more out of courtesy than belief that a story was there. He asked what they remembered. They answered in measurements. 600 pounds a panel. 2 pins per bay. 40 feet left when the first tank moved. The reporter wanted adjectives. They gave him numbers. Finally he said, "Why does it matter now?" The room went quiet. Peterson, who had kept the pencil and the habit, opened his foxed notebook and read without lifting his eyes. "We build because if we don't, no one gets home." He closed it. That's why. Pergrin, now retired, sent a letter the reunion read aloud. He thanked them for the work he'd never fully understood, even as he'd ordered it. He apologized for the years the records had mislaid their names. He included a line he'd written long ago in a book most of them hadn't read cover to cover. "A bridge is more than steel. It's a promise that someone will make it to the other side." The men nodded, some with their mouths, others with their hands flat on the table where the bolt lay. Years kept moving. The wire flowed as if it had nothing to do with any of this, which was both true and untrue. A French schoolteacher wrote to the Corps asking about a wartime crossing her grandfather had described. She received copies of the same carbon sheet. She brought it to class and told children that sometimes history is a sound, the creak of a span you can't see until you're standing on it. In a small county museum, the veterans donated their evidence. The cracked bolt went into a case on a square of dark felt. The placard read, "Deck Fastener, Bailey Bridge, Via River, August 1944. Below it, smaller type, "On loan from W. Carney." Visitors paused longer in front of that case than the diorama with the plastic Sherman. They leaned close, looking for the moment of failure captured in the fracture, and found instead the fact of endurance, the way the threads still held where they could. When the old man from Pennsylvania died, his daughter found the Corps' form letter in a drawer, the edges softened by rereading. She tucked it behind the glass with the bolt, not out of bitterness but completion. Paper and metal, both proofs, both partial. There were no parades for the 291st, only reunions and folded chairs and the slow, decent business of remembering. A pastor closed one gathering with a prayer that did not try to rescue anyone from the truth. Lord, thank you for the work that looks like work. The men laughed, because it sounded like something Peregrine would have said on a bad night when the river pushed back. Decades later, a young engineer touring the museum asked why the case mattered when the breakout to Avranches had been decided by generals and maps. The volunteer, a widow who had learned dates the way others learn recipes, pointed to the bolt. Because those maps don't move without this, she said. Because somebody held the line while the rest crossed. Outside, rain started, the kind that soaks by conviction rather than force. Inside, the cracked bolt sat quiet under glass, doing what bridges do after their moment, bearing witness to weight gone by. They didn't win the war with rifles or tanks. They won it with pins, rope, and 14 hours of impossible work, the kind that leaves no statue, only a road forward and the sound of a span refusing to break.